what happened is the Victorian government assigned risk ratings to every industry based on whether COVID would be likely to transmit or not. And then alongside those ratings, those that were non-essential were shut down. Okay, New South Wales is in that point now, but it took them a while to get there. And then hospital grade PPE and distancing was made mandatory, and it was regulated in all of the remaining essential areas where people were still working. And so that was an employer compliance measure. It wasn't just, as Dr. Kerry Chant has said there, a person cannot work in New South Wales unless they get a vaccination, one vax, and unless there is testing in their workplace. But those are two measures that are falling again on individuals. It's not dealing with the fact that there are employers who are actually putting people at risk, and there are now many stories coming out of employer non-compliance with allowing people to present at work regardless of whether they have symptoms or not, and not actually showing enough concern for the fact that they're transmitting and putting the public at risk. So I think that was one of the key differences, is that there was a stronger employer compliance role in Victoria.
And is it a matter of making employers more responsible and putting less emphasis on individual worker compliance, but regulating what the companies and employers are doing?
Absolutely. And so alongside that shift away from the individual focus, which is, I think, a distraction, then if you can move away to the broader, bigger structures like businesses, which are larger institutions in an economy, then we can start to talk about the role of policy and income supports. And that's what's been missing or slow to roll out in New South Wales. They've only just brought in these test and isolate payments, and they're still only available to workers in certain LGAs. But there are now numerous stories of casual workers who are concerned. They actually have symptoms, but they're right on the edge of insecurity and precarity, and they're almost on their butts without, having their rent not paid, no food on the table, and without those payments, then they're not being supported to actually take the test and isolate until they have a negative result. So this is a key income support that's needed to shift away from the individual and talk about this collective public response. And of course, it's very clear that New South Wales is going to always be dealing with this with one hand tied behind their back, because Victoria had both JobKeeper and the coronavirus supplement, they supported businesses that were told they had to shut down. They supported people while they were isolating, while they were staying home. And it's that's that very important income floor that the Commonwealth Morrison Government has to provide, but the New South Wales Government also has to be advocating and demanding it, and I'm not confident that Gladys is really getting her hands dirty in that space.
What about the role of state government in helping define who is an essential worker? I know that in Victoria they explicitly listed who was an authorised worker, and that New South Wales rejected that idea for quite a while in this outbreak. How important is that?
It's critical, and it showed that the failure of the government, New South Wales government, to define that and to provide the leadership that was required meant that the virus was transmitting and circulating in the community at a far greater rate. It could have been nipped in the bud earlier. And some of the rhetoric earlier on was, well, an essential worker is anyone who thinks that they are essential, or any business that thinks they are essential. And it's clear in that rhetoric that the aim here is to avoid any intervention into the private sector world. And that's really typical of the strategy that the New South Wales government has implemented, which is to celebrate the fact that business is at the table, helping to make decisions on public health matters. And I think Dr. Kerry Chant must be operating in incredibly difficult circumstances, and for all the talk of following health advice that we hear from Gladys, I don't think that that's always been the case. Otherwise, we would have had, for instance, these test and isolate payments to help, people in food production, abattoirs, logistics, working in warehouses. These people would have been supported to have tests and to be staying home much, much earlier on. And I think there's a very strong employer lobby role being played here to maintain a precarious and insecure workforce, because ultimately that's to the benefit of business operations in their short term.
What about the knock-on effects of that, though, Alison, when you talk about keeping workers at abattoirs home and other people who process our foods? I mean, we've heard the government explain many times that southwestern Sydney and Western Sydney in particular would have huge knock-on effects to keep everyone home there. Wouldn't we all be suffering more if that were the case?
I think that's the intention, is to build fear around what would happen if we reduced essential work production and services. But we have to acknowledge that it's entirely within the hands of government, and it's capable of reducing the amount of output, the amount of people that are going to work right now, and the amount of things and services that are being produced. That is one of the critical steps that the Victorian government took to rein in the second wave. It wasn't just assigning risk and assigning an essential brand or not. The government actually had to step in and say to even essential sectors, you must send home at least or up to 1/3 of all your staff. So there were 250,000 essential workers in Victoria last year who were ordered to go home. And I mean, we're talking incredible sacrifices here from both, those workers and businesses, made possible with the provision of JobKeeper. But that's the kind of intervention that was necessary. The public in Victoria, they were told by Premier Daniel Andrews, you might not see every meat you want. You might not have pork and beef and lamb and chicken, everything you want on the shelf at every point in time when you go to the supermarket, but there will be meat. There will be meat available. And that's the kind of messaging we had around preparing the public for any reduction in the choices they might have on a supermarket shelf, because that's really what we're talking about here with reducing essential work. It's not the amount of production, amount of stuff we're making right now actually isn't necessary to support the majority of people to be staying home and keeping this virus at bay.
And as an economist, Alison Pennington, what do you think of the overall strategy here to rely on the vaccine rollout to get us out of this crisis in New South Wales?
It's pretty clear we have to rein this in. We've got Delta, an unvaccinated population. Our vax program is still maturing. I think that's something important to keep in mind, is that we are nowhere near capable of, for instance, developing booster rounds, which is what Israel is already doing, because Delta is getting around Pfizer, where they've had the same vax targets that people like Gladys are now putting forward. They've had 70%, actually 80% of the adult population vaccinated, and they are looking at lockdowns now. So it's clear internationally that we are out of step. The strategy I think that New South Wales government is deploying is going to be found out as being not possible. What we have to do is protect all the population until everyone has access to a vaccine, and that includes children and young people who still are not eligible to access the vaccine. And we have to vax this beast out of existence. So that means all of the investments we need in our public healthcare system to make sure that the vaccination program is ready, that our hospitals have the capacity to deal with any cases. My position is that it's going to be in the interest of our economy and our healthcare outcomes in the long term to be protecting the population from the unmitigated spread of this virus.
That said, Alison, how do we even begin to grapple with the impact of these lockdowns, say a year from now? I guess particularly in regional areas like ours, where there are no COVID cases, but we're still in lockdown, and we're still getting our heads around the economic impact of the bushfires.
Yeah, devastating. I think. Yeah, casting your minds back to just the rolling crises that the Australian people have been plunged into. Look, for me as an economist, I have to make it clear that these crises need only affect us as much as our governments allow them to. And when people talk about the trade-offs of lockdowns, they are often starting from a basis that the federal government is somehow unable to make people's lives as comfortable as possible, and with all their basic needs met, while we ride out this virus and get it under control. And, you know, we saw from March last year when the pandemic hit, we saw the mass expansion of the coronavirus supplement, which gave people the things they needed, the money they needed to buy the essentials. And it lifted hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty, actually. It was an incredible measure. And then we had JobKeeper, which by all accounts, despite the rorting, provided a floor to support businesses to basically pause their operations, keep their staff on board with all that investment, all those skills, and then be able to reboot on the other side. So right now, the Morrison government, by not reinstating those two important measures at a time when half the country is in lockdown, I think is negligent. I think what they're doing is basically ensuring that we're going to have jobs go under and more lives will be at risk. And this will be far more painful and more costly than it needs to be. So I think it's really, really important that the federal government reintroduce those income supports programs so that we can all pull through.
Alison Pennington, great to get your analysis of this crisis at the moment. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.